paper. So this is material from my thesis that I'll be talking about today, although it's only from the English side. So I'll be discussing the very little known autobiographical text Down Below by the British Mexican surrealist artist and writer Leonora Carrington. The gestation of this text is multi-layered and bilingual. In this paper, I'll be seeking to give an overview of the complex history of the composition, focusing especially on the various interlocutors present in the text alongside Carrington. By considering these ghostly presences, it challenges the idea of the solitary author, and hopefully can shed light on the nature of autobiography, the narration of mental illness, and the ways we mediate experience through language and communication. So briefly, I will do a bit of biography about Carrington. She is starting to get a bit more of a following, and there have been some recent republications of some of her works, and certainly more recognition in the UK, whereas she's been very recognised for a long time in Mexico. But she was born in Lancashire in 1917 to a wealthy manufacturing family. And she was presented at court in the mid-1930s, around the same time as she enrolled in art school in London. And shortly afterwards, she met Max Ernst, the German surrealist, at a dinner party, and they began a relationship. She soon joined him in Paris, where she was initiated into the circle of surrealists. He was 26 years her senior, and invading his second ex-wife, they moved to the south of France, where they were living at the outbreak of World War II, which is where the text of Down Below begins. So Down Below is a very short text which records the events of Carrington's life after the Nazi occupation of France. So Ernst has been interred, and Carrington suffers a mental breakdown, and she escapes into Spain with the help of an English friend. And then in Madrid, her mental health declines even further. The British consulate become involved, and she is declared incurably insane, and at the request of her family, she is transferred to a sanatorium in Santander. And as she writes, I was handed over like a cadaver to Dr. Morales in Santander. Down Below describes the conditions and treatments in the asylum with brutal candor, while maintaining the fantastical associative power of her imagination, exacerbated and made unsettling by her break with reality. Analysis of the text is explored in some depth its potential symbolism, but often neglects the complex composition of the text, or records it as a cursory piece of trivia. In recent years, feminist analysis of this text has examined the ways in which it has represented, but also countered, the surrealist fixation with an aestheticized version of female madness. So it's a brief overview of the text as it was written, but we'll get now into the actual composition history where it starts to get complicated. So this is a note on the text which accompanies the 1987 version edited by Marina Warner. And Marina Warner writes, first written in English in 1942 in New York, text now lost, dictated in French to Menyon in 1943, then published in BVV number 4, February 1944, in a translation from the French by Victor Lona. The original French dictation was published by Edition Fontaine in Paris in 1946. Both the French dictation and the Victor Lona translation were used as the basis for the text here, which was reviewed and revised for factual accuracy by Leonora Carrington in 1987. But this still doesn't actually cover all of the steps which came to be in this text. So the 1987 version also includes a postscript, which was dictated to Warner or recorded in conversation with Warner in 1987. The original text, written in 1943, ends with Carrington still in the asylum, although she hints that she will soon manage to escape. In the postscript, Carrington describes how she leaves the asylum under the surveillance of a nurse to be transferred to a new asylum in South Africa at her family's request. But en route, while she's in Lisbon, she escapes and meets the Mexican diplomat Renato Leduc, who's an old acquaintance from Paris, who she marries in order to gain autonomy from her family and passage to New York. So the 1987 postscript ends with her in Lisbon about to leave for New York. And it's in New York shortly after these events conclude that she begins to write the original version in English. And then in the subsequent move to Mexico, this text is lost. So as Warner mentions that this was written, the text that we have is dictated in French to Menyon in 1943. This actually happened in an abandoned embassy building that Carrington was living in Mexico City in the summer of 1943. Well, one thing that I think does stand out in this note is how unusually bilingual this text is. It's resulting that the original meaning been ignored, even in works which compare down below directly to other works of French surrealism. I'm sorry, I think my internet connection might be unstable.
We lost you for just a moment. The last thing I heard was about how unusually bilingual the text was. So not back to there.
Sorry.
Okay.
I can't see any of the chat or anything while I'm sharing, so please do stop me. Yes, so I was saying that because the text is so bilingual, you might expect it can be difficult to establish which text we should actually be studying when we look at it. You might expect that the original French would be considered the true version, as it hasn't gone through translation. But this edition has overwhelmingly been ignored, even in works which compare down below directly to other works of French surrealism. Several factors are most likely at play here, namely the scarcity of the French edition, the earlier publication date of the English translation, and the prominence of English in Carrington's work overall. It might also be argued that the lost English original has a ghostly claim on the ultimate text, seeping into its structures and patterns. Initially conceived in English and first published in English, it's somewhat an accident of fate that the French version exists at all. And I'll come on now to my next slide. So there is actually another person missing from Marina Warner's very long note on the text, and that is Pierre Mabie. So alongside Carrington and Menyon in Mexico City in 1943, there's also Menyon's husband, Paul Mabie, whose name, as I said, wasn't mentioned before. He was a trained doctor with close associations with the Surrealists, and he's credited in various sources as a strong influence on the composition of Down Below. He is the interlocutor she addresses directly in the opening passages of the text, using the formal vous in the French, and it seems he encouraged her to attempt to record her experiences, possibly with the explicit intent of treating her trauma. So this is what she writes in the opening pages, addressing Mabie. Since I fortuitously met you, who I'm considered the most clear-sighted of all, I began gathering a week ago the threads which might have led me across the initial border of knowledge. I must live through that experience all over again, because by doing so, I believe that I may be of use to you, just as I believe that you will be of help in my journey beyond that frontier by keeping me lucid. I think this is really interesting because it has this kind of mutually beneficial relationship. This is the only place I think she directly addresses the fact that there is somebody else present while she's writing the text, and that he will be of use to her in helping her to relive this experience, but she will also be of use to him. What that use she might be of him might be isn't necessarily clear. I think it's also very interesting that maybe he is a medical doctor, but he's not a psychiatrist, but he's also a writer and a member of the Surrealist circle. So whether that help to him might be understanding mental illness better, or it might be an artistic appreciation of her experience, it's not very clear. So yes, and it's not very clear whether this exercise was meant to produce, was meant to be artistic, if it was meant to produce a text of literary merit, or if it was meant to be a medical treatment. So Natalia Lusty has written that it seems Mabie treated Carrington for severe anxiety and post-traumatic stress stemming from her experience in Spain, and that part of her treatment involved encouraging her to work through traumatic memories by formally recording them in the essay down below. And framing the narrative as a treatment aligns closely with Carrington's own comments on the writing process of Down Below. She writes, "I am in terrible anguish, yet I cannot continue living alone with such a memory. I know that once I've written it down, I shall be delivered." And the level of formality with which this was intended as a treatment is unclear though. And Marina Warner is much less concrete and describes Mabie merely as a friend who urged her to recreate the lost text. And within the text itself, Mabie is entirely silent. His impact suggested only from the perspective of Carrington. Again, casting him as this guide who may help her in her journey beyond that frontier. And the text in effect traces two journeys to that space down below, referring back to the title. In the first, Carrington is referring to a building that in the sanatorium, which she calls down below, which she believes if she gains access to this building, then it will mean that she has been cured. But the second journey down below is through the medium of narrative, returning beyond that frontier into the memory of her experience. And casting Mabie as a guide in that journey indicates the profound risk to the individual of writing an autobiography of trauma, and casts light on the potential value of a third party in the conventionally solitary act of writing. So it's been quite well established in the limited criticism that exists on this text that Mabie may or may not, to what extent we don't know, but he's certainly present and seemingly fairly influential in encouraging Carrington to write her experiences down. But the second interlocutor is his wife, Shemanyang, who we saw mentioned previously, who we believe receives Carrington's dictation. But in stark contrast to Natalia Lusty's emphasis on Mabie, she actually seems to be quite dismissive of the role of Menyon in writing the text. So this is from a footnote, and she writes, although the BVV and later versions of the essay conclude with the words as told to Menyon, Mabie's wife, thereby suggesting its oral transmission, throughout the essay itself, Carrington repeatedly draws attention to her actual writing of the narrative. So this is just from a footnote, and it kind of sparked a lot of the thinking behind this paper, in that it seems it's true that we can't really prove that that the text was dictated, and Menyon is entirely silent in the text. So how do we really know she is there at all? And but then also, if she is silent, does it matter if she's there or not? Does it matter if the text is spoken rather than written? I always think the use of phrasing here is interesting, that she says she draws attention to her actual writing of the narrative. And it made me think about, what does it mean to actually write? Does it mean, does it make a difference if it's spoken or written? And it is true that Carrington refers explicitly to writing, although not necessarily in a physical sense. There are no mentions of pen and paper and ink. Instead, she says, I've been writing for 3 days, and how can I write this when I'm afraid to think about it? Stranger still is that in addition to these references to writing, elsewhere in the text, there are the direct addresses to Mabie that take the aspect of speech, or fragments suggesting an oral tradition of storytelling. She says, I must go on with my story. These conflicting asides are consistent with a difficult multi-layered generation of the text, which feasibly could have included conversations with Mabie, dictation to Menyon, and traditional writing. So in order to really prove about whether dictation has actually taken place, I went back to look at the history of Carrington's other works in French. And on a practical level, the strongest evidence for Menyon's presence is linguistic. Carrington didn't write or speak French fluently, but as a lingua franca of the circle of international artists and intellectuals she mixed with in both Paris and New York, French can be traced as a hallmark of collaboration in her work. In her first published piece of fiction, which I'm showing you here, the preface, is the Max Ernst illustrated and prefaced at the House of Fear, and her subsequent short stories written in French in Paris. These all go to show that Carrington chooses to write in French when it serves a practical collaborative purpose. And a cursory comparison of the French publication of Down Below with other French texts by Carrington of a similar date shows a greater level of accuracy in spelling and grammar. And we know that this is very unlikely to be the work of a copy editor, because Carrington's French publisher, R3P3, who's mentioned here at the bottom of the picture of the French edition I have here, he intentionally didn't edit Carrington's mistakes for reasons I'll explain to you. So this is from another preface to some of Carrington's work in French. R3P3, her publisher, is recalling their first meeting and the events around the publication of The House of Fear in 1938. So I translate now, and he says, very thin, very pale, very dark haired. her gaze exquisitely wild under the arch of large black eyebrows. She made one think of the Belle Dame sur Merci from Keats's poem, of the adorable Titania from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Max Ernst made me read The House of Fear, a kind of waking dream that she had just written in recently acquired French. Belonging by birth to the English gentry, she had been in Paris only for a few months, and full of such charming Anglicisms that we decided to publish it on the spot without changing a single word. It's telling here that when he says we decided to publish it, it seems very much that he's talking about himself and Ernst and not Carrington making this decision. And this characterization that he has here fits exactly Carrington's perceived identity in this period as a muse, a surrealist femme enfant or woman child, who is prized for her untutored authenticity and in part her ignorance. And again, this is from the preface to The House of Fear that Ernst wrote. He emphasizes this ideal of the unknowingly brilliant muse. And he's using here the nickname that he gave to her, Le Mariée du Vent, the Bride of the Wind. He says, who is the Bride of the Wind? Does she know how to read? Does she know how to write French without mistakes? From what fuel does she fire herself? She is fueled by her intense life, by her mystery, by her poetry. She has read nothing, but drunk everything. She doesn't know how to read. So this is the context that we're looking at when we're thinking about Carrington writing in French. But I was thinking about whether her work in Down Below is under the same guise or the same tradition of her work in French, or how it might be different with the use of Shemanyang as somebody who she can dictate to. And if we can state then with some certainty that Menyon is present in the text as a recipient of the dictation, then what effect does this have? I believe the dictation has the immediate effect of creating a distance between the author and her words, an effect which is compounded by her use of French. When Carrington says, how can I write this when I'm afraid to think it? Perhaps the answer is the third pathway of dictation. More than merely internal thinking and less isolating than writing. What potential is there in telling such a story? Such a format is reminiscent of the confession, or indeed of a talking therapy. Remembering again that by the summer of 1943, Carrington had already written and lost a version of Down Below in English. Dictation is a distinct choice which sets this text apart from her other works in either language. The distancing effect of dictation in French may serve a protective purpose, but Carrington is also aware of shifts and expansions of meaning when using a language which is not her own. This sense of distance is echoed in Carrington's comments on the Spanish language within the text itself. She says, the fact that I had to speak a language I was not familiar with was crucial. I was not hindered by a preconceived idea of the words, and I but half understood their modern meaning. This made it possible for me to invest the most ordinary phrases with a hermetic significance. In Henri Parisot's praise of Carrington's naive French, there is something of a gendered paternalism. But here Carrington offers her own insight as to the potential of writing or speaking in a language not entirely familiar. Marina Warner has noted the strange quality of the language Down Below, no doubt born of this extraordinary gestation. She writes, this journey to and from oral and written versions, to and from French and English translations, accounts for the difference in tone between Down Below and Leonora's other writings. As only moments of distinctive Carrington drollness. It's as if in her dementia she vacated her own being, becoming for a while other, uttering in a different voice to a different pace, using another sentence structure. Becoming for a while other by inhabiting another language is a compelling idea, particularly in the context of surrealism. The potential as Carrington sees it, to invest the most ordinary phrases with a hermetic significance, allows elements of the everyday to be subjected to new scrutiny. Everything is felt to be new. This sensation of strangeness in the familiar is pertinent, therefore, not only to speaking a different language, but to the sensibilities of surrealism, and most crucially, the disconnection of mental illness. Trauma is an obvious factor in the absence of drollness here. There is an entanglement of subject matter and form where the two become so interdependent as to be almost indistinguishable. That is, there is a profound symbiosis between the content and the process of Down Below, and the distancing effect of speaking the text in French is a necessary product of the very experiences narrated. Finally, I'd like to just come to my favorite part of this text in any of the versions, which is the letter that Carrington writes to, so Henri Parisot asks for her permission to publish the text in French in 1945. And she says, yes, but you have to publish this letter as a preface. And this has all of the errors that aren't present in the main body of the text, which has been dictated. And so the translation here is, you have perhaps not understood the annoyance that I still feel. I am no longer the young ravishing girl who came to Paris in love. I am an old woman who has lived a lot and I've changed. If my life is worth something, I am the result of time. So I will no longer reproduce the image from before. I will never be petrified in a youth which no longer exists. And then at the very end of the letter, she says, try to understand that. So where Carrington's use of French has previously been used to infantilize her, here she asserts her old age, although she's still in her mid-20s at this point. And the naivety of the femme enfant is no longer appropriate for someone with her traumatic experience and hard-earned knowledge. And I'll stop there.